Episode 8. It's all ruined. At the last second, Allegro stormed over the country road with his tail twitching when a car appeared next to the gravel truck and blocked his way. Bibi and Chico were on Allegro's heels. When Bibi realized that the stallion and the two vehicles were rushing towards each other, she raised her arms and quickly shouted, "Eeny, meeny, car and truck, rolling wheels at once be stuck, whiz, whiz." Not a second later, both vehicles came to an abrupt stop. Blocked by this new constellation of roadgoers, Allegro slowed his pace to a near standstill, stopping just before the family car. Bibi and Chico breathed a sigh of relief. The young Spaniard rode quickly to the stallion, jumped out of the saddle, and carefully grabbed his halter, speaking calmly. "Calmate, muchacho, calm down. Somos amigos. We are friends, after all." Allegro was safe again. The drivers and passengers didn't find it the least bit amusing that they apparently couldn't make any progress at all now, saved horse or not. The furious father of the family got out to reprimand Bibi. But before he had the chance to get a word in, she raised her arms again and said, "Eeny, meeny, hold the shout. All you drivers just chill out. Whiz, whiz." The family that had only moments ago been barking angrily at each other now seemed completely relaxed. The fact that they got stuck in the middle of the road seemed to make no difference at all. On the contrary, the father looked at his wife with satisfaction. "We should do this more often, drive without navigation." "Just sitting in the car," the mother remarked calmly. "Much better than at home," her older son added. Bibi rode to Chico and Allegro, who fortunately appeared unharmed, but now they should ride back to Martin's farm as soon as possible. The sky had darkened even further, and the gusts of wind became stronger. In the distance, a loud rumble of thunder rolled over the landscape. Bibi examined Chico as they rode side by side with Allegro over the meadows. He still seemed quite distressed. "What did Count Falco say?" Bibi finally asked him. Chico waved it off. "Forget it." Bibi looked at him in surprise. "I thought you talked to him." "Count Falco does not want me as a son," Chico replied, staring straight ahead. With a grim expression, he added, "Perhaps it was a bit hasty to approach him with this." A quiet reproach resonated in his appearance. "I'm sorry about that." All of a sudden, Bibi had a bad conscience because she had pressured him to tell the Count as soon as possible. Chico nodded grimly. "Yes, that doesn't do me much good now either." He urged Tricky to speed up. "Maybe we should hurry up a little. The storm will be here soon." When a mighty thunderclap sounded, they galloped off. There wasn't much more to say anyway. Last evening by the sea. Ethelbert entered the library with a fully loaded tray in his hand. The master of the house lay on the sofa with a troubled expression on his face, pondering life. With a knowing look, Ethelbert placed the tray down and handed the Count a porcelain cup from which emerged a light steam. "Sir Count, your sage honey poppy milk. It will calm you down." Count Falco nodded happily and sat up. "Yes, thank you, Ethelbert. You know, I am perfectly—" He stalled, finding it difficult to talk about his feelings. The story with Chico had taken him completely by surprise, and his mind was in a muddle. He looked helplessly at Ethelbert. "I've never seen myself like this." His hand trembled a bit as he stirred his milk. The butler sat down beside him and took hold of his feet. In very bad cases, only a relaxing foot massage could help. Ethelbert's restraint distinguished him, but of course he wanted to help the Count find clarity in his thoughts, and thus asked, "You were once in Andalusia, weren't you?" "Yes, of course," replied the Count, "to buy horses." "I know that," replied Ethelbert, "but what makes Chico think you could be his father?" All of a sudden, Count Falco smiled an almost hysterical smile that ended as quickly as it had broken out. He drank a sip of milk, then looked at Ethelbert somewhat shyly and said, "Elena." "Elena?" Ethelbert asked. Elena Montoya, explained Count Falco. That was the name of the horse breeder. Ethelbert raised an eyebrow. Really? Count Falco cleared his throat, embarrassed. Elena was a very beautiful woman, he quickly added, but our relationship was purely business. Ethelbert smiled knowingly. Count Falco nodded pensively. Our last evening by the sea, we had a few glasses of red wine. On the beach, he frowned. And then I only remember waking up the next day. Ethelbert nodded. Yes, you always do that. And after that? Count Falco looked at him in astonishment. After that? What did he mean by that? But what happened? Ethelbert tried to give him a hint. Just listen to your inner self. Inside myself, replied Count Falco in indignation. What is there for me to hear, Ethelbert? Speaking of hearing, get me the receiver. The butler nodded politely and stood up, even though he'd still not learned what had actually happened. He handed the telephone to Count Falco, but the man was so upset that he dropped it on the floor. Ethelbert picked it up without comment. Count Falco sighed. You see, I cannot even... The Count was really beside himself. But to find out more, he now wanted to speak to Elena personally. Out with it. In the stables at Martin's farm, Alex helped Tina to look after the horses from the paddock. Tina set about cleaning Amadeus while waiting anxiously for Bibi to return. Though the storm had intensified in the time she was gone, Alex was confident that nothing had happened to her. Tina hesitated before carefully asking, "Why were you so angry with Chico? He's a great guy." Alex pulled a face. "You talk like my father." Tina stuttered. "What? No, I just wanted... It's really hard. Maybe this will be a big shock for you." Alex stared at her nervously. You don't want to break up now, do you?" Tina shouted. "No!" She cleared her throat. She wanted so much to tell Alex what she knew, but wasn't allowed to. She could prepare him, or at least she thought she could, and set her eyes on him meaningfully. There's a surprise for you." "Okay, what is it?" Alex asked, slowly becoming more curious where Tina was heading with this. At that moment, they heard Bibi calling from outside and rushed to meet her in the yard. The treetops bowed in the storm, and Bibi had a hard time leading Sabrina and Allegro into the stable. Tina took the reins off Allegro and looked at Bibi, relieved. "Just made it." "Quick, close the door," Bibi called to Alex, after Chico and Tricky also arrived. Alex was able to close it just before the next squall hit the gate. The storm had become violent as the first branches flew over the yard. Roger looked out of the kitchen window with concern. Finn and Ellie didn't mind spending the afternoon in the house playing with Billy the Kid, who was allowed to be in the kitchen for a change. Only Felina sat a bit uneasy at the table. The weather was scary for her. Fortunately, Roger was with them. Tina looked at Bibi inquisitively while they removed Sabrina's saddle together. "What's going on? Will he tell Alex?" she asked quietly. Bibi shrugged her shoulders. He talked to Count Falco, but he wasn't so pleased. Maybe Chico will leave now. Tina looked at her startled. How stupid would that be? That really wouldn't help anyone. Bibi nodded and took the saddle. Tina thought about it for a moment. They had to prevent him from leaving. Chico was busy putting Tricky's saddle away when Tina stood next to him. Bibi only meant well. It was right that you went to Falco. Chico first stared at her, amazed, then shook his head in disappointment. I asked her not to say anything. That's not possible, Bibi defended Tina. We're best friends. She looked at Chico quizzingly. When will you tell Alex? Not at all, Chico replied curtly. What does he get out of it? If you really are his brother, Tina began. Yes, I am, Chico interrupted her gruffly. Then he has a right to know it, Tina continued. Then she added fiercely, otherwise, I'll do it. On the verge of being angry, Chico now approached Bibi. That's exactly why I asked you to stay out of it. Tina wants to tell Alex. Why had Bibi told Tina? Startled, Bibi turned to her friend. Tina, please don't. It's all my fault anyway. If anyone is to blame, it's the Count, Tina replied with a grim expression. Then the stable door opened, and Alex, who brought the cleaning tools in to store them safely from the storm, returned to the group. Chico crossed his arms in front of his chest. Not him, too. But Alex ignored the tense atmosphere, only wanting to know what they were talking about all the time. All right, friends, what's going on? You're scurrying back and forth, and I know you've got a surprise planned. But it's sure not my birthday, or Christmas, or a trip to the chocolate factory. He looked at all of them expectantly. Okay, out with it. Chico turned to Bibi and Tina. Thanks a million. Then he took a deep breath and said to Alex, Okay, look, the thing is, I am your brother. Alex stared at him stunned. For a moment he said nothing at all, then cleared his throat. I'm sorry, what? He looked at Bibi and Tina for help. This could hardly be true. But Bibi nodded her approval, and with a rather pathetic smile, Tina said softly, Surprise? What about Alexander? While the storm whistled and thundered around Falkenstein Castle, Count Falco was still trying to find the phone number of Chico's mother, Elena. In the presence of Ethelbert, he spoke excitedly into the telephone. Yes, hello? I want to talk to the Andalusian registration office. The Andalusian Registrazione Officina Office of Administración? Si. But suddenly the line was disconnected. Hello? Hola? Astonished, the Count looked to his butler. The line is dead. Maybe lightning struck, Ethelbert mused. Count Falco protested furiously. Oh no, this is one big scheme, a conspiracy. Would it be so bad if Chico were your son? Ethelbert tried to calm the Count. After all, he is a well-bred young man. That's not the point, cried Count Falco. I have a reputation to uphold, Ethelbert. People are talking. I don't want to know what they are saying, he faltered. And above all, what about Alexander? Obviously, that was his biggest worry. How would his son react to this news? In fact, Alex was quite flattered by Chico's revelation. Everything that Bibi, Tina, and Chico tried to explain began to illuminate in his brain. Rather pale in the face, he stared at the Spaniard and asked, You're really serious, aren't you? Chico nodded his head. Alex stuttered. But when, how, where? Chico sighed. Okay, it's like this. My father, or our father... No, not a good start, as he gathered by the sight of Alex's downturned face. Hastily, Chico tried to explain it once again from a different angle. Okay, my mother, Elena Montoya, is a horse breeder. Bibi and Tina listened up. Montoya? Tina asked. I thought your name was De La Mancha. Chico's face reddened a little. Disculpa. Yes, that was a bit of a fib. Embarrassed, he added to Alex, Anyway, your father bought horses from her, and she fell in love with him. Alex shook his head. I can't really imagine that. Tina pulled a face. I somehow can't imagine it either. Chico affirmed. It's really true. It's all in my mother's diary, and Count Falco even wrote her a love letter back then. And you read it? Tina asked, taken aback. Chico was now even more embarrassed. He was crestfallen that they didn't want to believe him. Bibi looked at him sympathetically. Okay, but then why did your mother never contact Count Falco? She is a very proud woman, replied Chico. Maybe she wanted to make it on her own. He nodded as if he wanted to confirm it for himself. Maybe so no one would say afterwards that she only wanted his money. He could tell from the looks of Alex and Tina that they still weren't convinced. You don't have to believe me, he waved disappointedly. Bibi looked him firmly in the eyes. But I believe you, she said. Chico returned her gaze and smiled. For a fleeting moment, the two forgot everything that was happening around them. Only a loud neighing snapped them back to the present. The pregnant mare, Lottie. Tina was shocked and asked, "What's wrong with Lottie?" The four of them ran quickly to Lottie's stall. Chico carefully opened the gate and went inside with Tina. Alex was still completely dumbstruck. He pulled Bibi back into the stable alley to talk. "You could have said something." "But Chico wanted to tell you himself," Bibi replied. The foal is coming. Mrs. Martin hurried into the stable to see if the weather was disturbing the pregnant mare. Chico, who was already sitting next to Lottie and stroking her gently, was relieved when Tina's mother entered. He had noticed that her water had broken, which meant that the birth was imminent. Mrs. Martin leaned down next to him to discuss Lottie's condition. Alex was still standing outside the stall with Bibi. The shock was still deep. "This is really crazy." Bibi fixed on him with tenderness. "Yes, I know, but what do you think?" Alex shrugged. "No idea. It's just, well, everything is so new." Back in her stall, Chico examined the pregnant mare, alarmed, and looked at Mrs. Martin. "Something isn't right," he said. "I think the foal is the wrong way around." Mrs. Martin nodded. This was also her fear. "Yes, we need Dr. Squirrel. If the foal is stuck because Lottie is too weak, then—" Tina, who stroked Lottie's head and spoke to her calmly, felt deeply concerned. Mrs. Martin sighed. "Then the foal can suffocate in the womb." She got up carefully, as not to frighten Lottie, and ran out of the stable to call Dr. Squirrel. Bibi and Alex were still standing in the lane talking. "Your father doesn't want Chico as a son," said Bibi. This bit of news amazed Alex. "But my father thinks everything Chico has done so far has been great," which had annoyed him often enough. "That's right," Bibi agreed with him. "Why doesn't he want it then?" Alex went into it. Bibi shrugged helplessly. "No idea." But of course she also wanted to know why Count Falco didn't want to accept Chico as a son. Then she had an idea. "Why don't we just ask him?" Without waiting for Alex's answer, she continued. "Do you think he's at the castle?" "Where else?" Alex replied. When he thought about it, however, he had little desire to talk to his father. And how could they get to the castle in the storm? The wind whistled louder and louder around the stable, and everything that wasn't nailed down was rattling. Bibi had already raised her arms and said, "Eeny meeny, swift transition. Bring the Count to this position. Whiz, whiz." Count Falco was standing on the ladder in his library, reaching up to the shelf in search of documents about the Andalusian horse purchases. Perhaps they would reveal something about Elena, he thought, when suddenly he was hauled forcefully downwards, only to find himself standing before his son and Bibi in the stable at Martin's farm. He shouted immediately, "Bibi, you can't just ship me here against my will." "Of course I can, and I have to," said Bibi. "Yes, father," Alex agreed with her. Mrs. Martin, who returned to the stable at that moment, greeted the Count in astonishment. "Falco, what are you doing here?" "A good question, Suzanne, a very good question," replied the Count furiously. But Mrs. Martin had quite different concerns. "You must help me," she asked Bibi. "I can't reach Dr. Squirrel, and I think the lines are dead." Count Falco nodded. "Yes, I've already noticed that." Mrs. Martin paid him no attention. "Can you do that? It is an absolute exception, but it's all for the sake of helping Lottie," she urged. Bibi nodded. Of course she wanted to help. With hands raised and fingers poised, she chanted, "Eeny meeny, doctor's call, send Dr. Squirrel to Lottie's stall, whiz whiz." Suddenly, Dr. Squirrel stood in Lottie's box, but in his bathrobe. "Bibi, I was about to shower," he stated firmly. "Did you turn off the water?" Mrs. Martin asked, concerned. When the vet nodded, Mrs. Martin smiled with relief. "Good. Excuse me, Robert, but this is an absolute emergency. Lottie is having her foal, and it's the wrong way around." The vet was a man of action. He turned to Bibi and demanded, "Bibi, pants." Bibi granted his wish immediately. Eeny meeny, by all means, give the doc a pair of jeans. Whiz whiz. Whereupon the veterinarian stood before everyone in glitter pants. Dr. Squirrel shook his head impatiently. No, not the party trousers. But why get upset? Of course he could also work in them. Now, all that was missing was his doctor's bag, which Bibi quickly fetched. Eeny meeny, bag asunder. Doctor's tools come through the thunder. Whiz whiz. With everything he needed now at hand, Dr. Squirrel approached the pregnant mare. Tina and Chico moved aside quickly and let the vet palpate Lottie's stomach. It must be the other way around, he agreed, and set about turning the foal in Lottie's belly. So, Lottie, gentle, gentle. We'll get it turned around. Tina, Chico, and Mrs. Martin gave him a hand. Alex suddenly noticed that his father had disappeared. Everything in a bucket. Count Falco didn't know whether he should be happy or incensed that no one paid him any attention. His son and Bibi had been so transfixed by what was happening in Lottie's stall that he'd left the stable unnoticed. Once outside, he braced himself against the wind. But that was only the beginning. With every passing minute, the storm seemed to grow more violent as dust, small branches, and bits of hay swirled through the air. From out of nowhere, a bucket blew off a rooftop towards the Count and landed with a clatter directly on his head. Count Falco gave up. With drooping shoulders, he stumbled back to the stable. Dr. Squirrel tried to soothe Lottie with all the tricks of veterinary medicine. Fortunately, she was an experienced mare with strong nerves and could sense that someone was there to help her. The foal was breech and had to be turned back to the right position, with the forefeet to the front, pressing against its little head. Dr. Squirrel finally managed to turn the foal and help Lottie lie down gently while Tina stroked the mare's muzzle. The doctor remained in the rear with Suzanne Martin's help, supporting Lottie during the birth. A rope had to be wrapped around the front legs of the foal and pulled ever so carefully at every contraction. This time, Alex noticed it when the stable door opened. To his great surprise, he saw his father stagger in with a bucket on his head, moaning with aggravation. Alex ran to him and closed the stable door. "What is this for tomfoolery?" the Count's voice echoed from under the bucket. "I want to go back to Falkenstein Castle." Alex hardly understood him. "What do you want, father? Could you please remove the bucket?" he asked, reaching for the edge. But Count Falco took a step back and shook his head with the bucket still on it. "Stop! Stop, 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 stop! Everything stays as it is!" "What?" retorted Alex, running out of patience. What kind of absurd show was his father putting on now? With a jerk, Count Falco pulled the bucket from his head. "I want it to stay right where it is. My life is in the dumps at the moment anyway, and this perspective has its advantages. I see nothing, and nobody sees me either." And with that, he put the bucket back over his head. "Father, you can't just put a bucket on your head and run away when there's a problem," Alex replied. "You have to face the facts. Chico is your son." No sooner had he said this than he realized that he had long since accepted his new brother. Although he couldn't see his face, Alex knew that his words hit his father deeply. After a considerably long pause, Count Falco spoke to his son in a muffled tone. "You know about this?" Alex nodded. "Yes, I know. And can you please remove the bucket now?" Finally, Count Falco followed the boy's request and pulled the bucket from his head. He looked at Alex resignedly. Alex looked calmly into his eyes. "I am happy, father. I always wanted a brother, and you know that too. I don't understand why you can't just give him a chance." "Please excuse that I am overwhelmed. Suddenly I am supposed to have another son?" Count Falco answered gruffly. "Oh, but back in Spain you weren't overwhelmed," Alex replied, unmoved by his father's disapproving stare. "Sometimes you just have to face the truth and stand by it. Everything else is the mark of a coward." "Watch your tone, my son," Count Falco replied. Alex shook his head and answered loudly and firmly. I am not moderating my tone now. You always talk so much about honesty, but when it comes down to it, you fold like a wilted flower. Count Falco raised his voice. Well, that's just... Suddenly, Mrs. Martin stood between them. Can both of you finally just be quiet? She hissed. Lottie is just getting her foal in there. One more word and I'll throw you out. She hurriedly returned to the stall. Now Count Falco felt that he was being treated unfairly all the more. But Alex was not yet finished with him. You're so egotistical. I don't want to be your son anymore either. This time, I disown you from me. And what can Chico do about that, huh? Defeated, Count Falco looked at the tense faces of Bibi and Chico, who had observed the whole argument. With careful consideration, he took one step towards Chico, then another step, and then another. Step by step, Dr. Squirrel was also making progress in Lottie's stall. The time had definitely arrived. Dr. Squirrel pulled the rope and called out, 1, 2, 3. Lottie, you have to join in. Count Falco was now standing before Chico and cleared his throat. Now that Alexander is happy, and all the others apparently are as well... He stopped to look at Alexander and Bibi, knowing now in his heart what was right. Count Falco nodded at Chico and tried his best Spanish, which he managed quite well. Bienvenido a la familia, querido Chico. Smiling, he translated. Welcome to the family, dear Chico. It's a little stallion, Dr. Squirrel resounded from the stall at that moment. Count Falco, Alex, and Chico turned their heads. The foal had its first view of the world. Alex's father was beaming and gave Chico a touching nudge on the side. I have a second son. 2 sons. I must announce it to the world. The Count put his 2 sons' arms around his shoulders and pulled them close. Then he loosened his grip again, taking them in with one long gaze of affection. 2 sons, the miracle of birth. The 3 embraced each other again in celebration. Everything was so new and beautiful. The fact that Count Falco had a second son, and Alex had a brother at the same time a new foal was born, was truly magical. Lottie sniffed at her baby, who was now lying in the straw, exhausted. She gently nudged him as if urging him to stand. Uncertain, the little foal tried to right himself. Finally, he stood on all 4s and took his first shaky steps. Alex, Tina, Chico, Bibi, and Suzanne Martin stood at the edge of the stall and watched, welling up with emotion as the foal nudged the mother with its snout and drank from her for the first time. Welcome to life. That seemed to be exactly what Count Falco thought too, smiling over Mrs. Martin's shoulder at the animals and his boys. Gone with the wind. The storm had died down during the foal's birth. Tina opened the stable door and was the first to step outside. The picture was one of devastation. The fences around the hen houses had fallen over. Hay and straw were scattered everywhere. Tools and buckets lay around, and the hens had crouched in between fallen branches. The others soon followed. Mrs. Martin and Dr. Squirrel surveyed the farm in shock. It looked bad. Tina sighed. Well, the storm has done quite a lot of damage. Bibi nodded. Yeah, inside and out. Mrs. Martin was at the end of her tether in view of the scattered hay. My word! Not the hay as well. Now we have no more feed. Dr. Squirrel also let the chaos sink in. Oh yes, that looks like a lot of work. His own work was waiting, and besides, he absolutely had to put on something sensible. I think I'd better be going now, he chimed and hurried away as the others thanked him. Utterly dismayed, Mrs. Martin entered the big barn where she kept the hay. It had flown around everywhere, and the scattered feed was soaked with rainwater. Gone with the wind. My Martin's farm, she explained, and crouched down next to the henhouse. I simply can't keep up. I've run out of ideas. Mummy! Tina rushed to her. She had never experienced her mother like that before. Bibi watched them empathetically. Suddenly, someone spoke up. "Money problems? Maybe I can help you after all." Everyone turned around to discover Kim Win-Win, who appeared out of nowhere. Nodding politely, she added, "I show up when people need me. Leave your pasture to me and all your money worries are over." Bibi gave Kim Win-Win a sharp look. She had guessed that this woman was nothing but trouble. Just at that moment, the barn door also broke loose from its hinges and landed with a clamorous bang directly in front of Count Falco. He stared at a bolt in his hand, which he had just pulled whimsically out of its hinge. When he noticed the others all staring at him, the Count quickly hid the bolt behind his back and smiled innocently.